welcome to Cuyahoga Community College's Western Campus. My name is Janice Taylor Hurd, and I'm the Dean of Academic Affairs here at Western Campus in Brunswick. And I'd like to thank you for coming out to our Carol S. Franklin Social Science Speaker Series. So for those of you who are not familiar with the series, the series was established to create a forum to enhance student learning and awareness of current events and issues relevant to a global and diverse community. Speakers are invited to engage students and the wider community in a critical dialogue on issues of their expertise in hopes that the civic life of our community will be enriched and strengthened through a more informed student body. The series provides members of the college community with opportunities to interact directly with people who are shaping national discourse on pressing issues of the day. In the past, we have presented speakers who have encouraged us to think about larger implications and consequences of our choices while encouraging lifelong learning and civic responsibility. And as we hope, will also create well-rounded people who are confidently functioning in a pluralistic and a multicultural society as citizens, leaders, and creators and thinkers. Distinguished scholars and thinkers, authors, artists, and public figures who are all well known and respected throughout the social sciences have been invited to share their perspectives and thoughts here at the college. And so we will also have the honor of having a distinguished speaker who happens to be one of our own, who we are very proud of. So following, just a housekeeping note, following today's lecture, there'll be a book signing and reception to meet the author. Students who need documentation of their attendance, there's a table out, social science table out in the lobby where you can get an extra credit slip. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce to you Professor Justin Miller, Assistant Professor of Philosophy.
Thank you. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here to introduce our speaker today. Let me give you, some of you probably already know, but I'm going to give you the lowdown here. Samuel H. LaPuma is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Cuyahoga Community College's Western Campus, where he has been teaching since 1991. Having earned both his master's and bachelor degrees in philosophy from the University of Dayton, he has also published papers in the field of bioethics in the American Journal of Bioethics, the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, and the Journal of Bioethical Inquiry, among others, and is the co-author of The Dying Experience, Expanding Options for Dying and Suffering Patients with Joseph P. DeMarco, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Cleveland State University. LaPuma's work centers on end-of-life care and brain death, and his areas of expertise are in the bioethics of palliative care and brain death, ethical theory, applied ethics, philosophy of science, the history of philosophy and music, and online learning. And as broad as that sounds and impressive as it is, it doesn't capture the breadth of the experience of talking, doing, having conversations about philosophy with Sam LaPuma. How many students, who are the students here? Sam's students, former students, all those. All right, you can go ahead and turn to someone who didn't raise their hand and tell them that we're in for a real treat. So without further ado, I give you Professor Sam LaPuma.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I first have several people I would like to thank. First and foremost, my former boss, Dean Carol Franklin, the person who's started all of this. Dr. Franklin was a wonderful leader. She was so supportive of all of my projects, and I really grew under her leadership here, and I'm so grateful to be a part of this series. It's a real honor. The most recent presentation I went to was my colleague Jeannie Hall, and she really did a marvelous job. She set the bar really high, so I hope I can live up to that. I would also like to thank our campus leadership, my divisional dean, Dr. Courtney Clark, our academic dean, you just heard her speak, Dr. Janice Taylor-Hurd, and our campus president, Dr. Donna Imhoff. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Kate Ketanesi and Rachel Staley, for their marvelous work of promoting this. It was really tireless. I appreciate all their effort. I kept seeing my posters all over the place. I was on high vis. It was just wonderful. I wanted to thank them for all their work. I also have some special family members. My wife Kathy is here, my son Dominic. I have two other children, Austin and Nina, who couldn't be here. I have my sister Diane, and my parents are deceased. I know they would have loved to be here, but I have two very special guests that have been members of my family all of my life. My Uncle Chuck and Aunt Louise Russo, they're well into their 90s, but they said they wouldn't miss this for the world, and I'm so blessed to have them here. Last but not least, I wanted to thank my co-author, Joe DeMarco, who's also here. I met Joe getting to be closer to 20 years now when I was a student of bioethics, and after the class, we started to develop a professional relationship, and it's been the most profound and enriching fulfilling part of my academic career. So I'm thrilled to have Joe here with us today, and I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your schedule to come and hear my presentation. I wanted to start by taking a look at the subtitle of our book, Expanding Options for Dying and Suffering Patients. So that will really be the main focus. There's only so many options dying and suffering patients have right now in healthcare, and we want to see those options expanded. I'll get into more of the specifics about what that would involve, but just keep that in mind as the overarching theme. I wanted to begin with a little story told by one of my favorite doctors and also bioethicist, Dr. Timothy Quill. Dr. Quill has done a remarkable job regarding the death and dying culture, and he really instituted almost verbatim the first physician-assisted suicide legislation that passed in Oregon. And in one of his books, he had this story that he told called Chi-Chi. And I'm going to briefly paraphrase it for you. It goes like this. There are three lost sailors. They're on a remote, deserted island. They're brought to their leader, and they're very apprehensive, obviously. They don't know what's going to happen. The leader says to the first sailor, that's now a prisoner, says, would you like death or Chi-Chi? And well, they all knew what death was. Nobody was quite sure of Chi-Chi, so he went out on a limb and he says, okay, well, I'll try Chi-Chi. So Chi-Chi ended up being not good at all. It was awful. I'll spare you the gruesome details. Had to do with tearing all your skin out and ripping out all your internal organs while you're still alive, and then they kill you. So this is a very terrible experience. So they go to the second sailor, prisoner. What do you want, death or Chi-Chi? And he saw what happened. He's a little apprehensive, but he thought, maybe it'll be different this time. So he says, okay, I'll try Chi-Chi, but no good. So he goes through the same torment, and he's killed. Well, the third sailor prisoner, when offered the choice, has seen enough, and he says, you know, I'll just choose death. And the leader looked puzzled at first, and he goes, okay, but Chi-Chi first. And this is really what we're after here in this context. Is we know that we're finite, and we know we have to die, but we want to, and we all desire a good death, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. I had a historical overview of how different cultures view death and dying, and I don't have time to go into details, so just going to gloss over some slides here about, what was a good death in ancient Greece, typically in battle. I did want to focus a little bit more on this issue of the Hippocratic Oath. I was always interested in how many citations there were
that had to do with a supposed prohibition against killing that came from the Hippocratic Oath. And so I want you to look at these two very typical translations. I will not give a drug that is deadly to anyone if asked. And another standard translation, I will not give a poison to anyone, though asked to do so, nor will I suggest such a plan. I did some research on this, and I found a very interesting article by a Dutch scholar named Anton van Hoof, and he said this isn't really what it means. In his view, and this is a citation from him, the Hippocratic doctor only swears that under no circumstances shall he lend himself to murder by poisoning on the request of a third person. Since being in close contact with a patient, he was in a position to kill secretly. We should remember that the fear of being poisoned was common in antiquity. A patient who hired a Hippocratic physician could be sure that he did not run the risk of being murdered by a criminal doctor. So this prohibition, if you look at these lines, I will not give a deadly drug to anyone. I will not give a drug that is deadly to anyone if asked. It seems to imply by the patient, but really it's by a third party. And so really what the Hippocratic prohibition here is don't be an accomplice to murder. And I think we can all agree that that's certainly a sound moral position to hold. I wanted to talk briefly too about the word euthanasia. I think it's commonly misunderstood in our contemporary culture. It's associated with something that's actually immoral, almost like murder. Like if you find that something, if it was an act of euthanasia, it must be immoral. But if you look at the etymology of it, it just simply means a good death. The prefix eu, which you see in these other terms like eulogy and euphemism, eu means good, thanatos is death. And so in essence, all it means is a good death. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with some of our contemporary meanings. But that shifted. In the 19th century, this Irish historian named William Lecky gave us what we now consider euthanasia, the intentional ending life in order to end suffering from disease. Now, even given that definition, we have to ask ourselves, is this morally appropriate or immoral? And we're gonna explore that throughout the presentation. Generally in ancient Greece, the most important thing was to avoid an undignified death. I'm not gonna bother doing the scholars. The Plato on suicide's a little inconsistent, passages that seem to support it, other passages seem to prohibit it, Aristotle a little bit that seems to prohibit it. A few other ancient views, Diogenes, as you can see from some of these, is kind of a crazy historical figure, but as a cynic, and the head cynic, he certainly isn't going to have an overt rejection to suicide. And then Epicurus, the pursuit of pleasure, but not a base hedonism. It was a sophisticated philosophy, and they have an acceptance for the gravest of circumstances. I did want to spend a little bit more time on Epictetus and Stoicism. I find a lot of wisdom in Stoicism. And generally, they look at the world as divinely ordained. You have a role in it. A lot of analogies to Stoicism are that you're in a play. You've been given a role by God. There's no sense in battling it. You should accept it. So I had this citation from Epictetus. Some things are in our control and others not. If you are averse to sickness or death or poverty, you will be wretched. Remove aversion then from all things that are not in our control and transfer it to the things contrary to the nature of what is in our control. If, for example, you are fond of a specific ceramic cup, remind yourself that it is only ceramic cups in general you are fond. Then if it breaks, you will not be disturbed. If you kiss your child or your wife, say that you only kiss things which are human, and thus you will not be disturbed if either of them dies. So I brought up my family here, my favorite ceramic cup, although my poor football team isn't doing well as usual. Also, our campus president is a Steelers fan, so I always have to think about that on Sundays. I have my wonderful wife, my two boys, my daughter. Supposedly, if my cup breaks, any of them dies, I'm not to be disturbed. But this would need interpretation. Of course, we need to be in grief. But what I think the wisdom there is the acceptance of that which is inevitable. And I find that also with our finitude. We need to have more of an acceptance of our finitude. I found this on my Facebook newsfeed, which I found kind of interesting, to show you that this wisdom is still with us today. When you can't control what's happening, challenge yourself to control the way you respond to what's happening. That's where the power is. This perfectly reflects the Stoic philosophy, and it's still with us today. Again, I'm not going to do too much with Roman death, certain ambivalence towards suicide, and I'm going to gloss over the medieval era. What we find with these scholars, Augustine, and also St. Thomas Aquinas, is a general prohibition based on Catholicism. So these thinkers often tried to Christianize the works of Plato and Aristotle as philosophers, and they developed sophisticated arguments to show that suicide was inappropriate. This basically remains with us today. Suicide is often thought of as some kind of taboo. We're very leery of it in a sense. These prohibitions continued until we got more to the modern era. And one of my favorite philosophers, David Hume, had a lot of insights. And when he wrote an essay on suicide, he actually didn't publish it right away. He was a little nervous about the repercussions because of how liberal it was. But in Hume's view, you don't have a duty to sustain your own existence. And I want you to look at this distinction I have here about beneficence, no duty to beneficence. And what he means by this is we don't owe each other anything. Now, in morality, it's much easier for me to tell you what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't make false promises, you shouldn't lie, and you shouldn't injure people, and so forth. So prohibitions can be somewhat straightforward, but how much should we do for other people? You can work on it and you can develop theories, but it's much more difficult. And for Hume, he says, well, I don't have a direct duty to anybody else, and that only non-maleficence, that's what I just went over. I don't want to hurt people, harm them, be a lie, and so forth. So his statement on suicide goes like this. Man is stopped by rivers in his passage over the surface of the earth, and rivers, when properly directed, lend their force to the motion of machines, which serve to the use of man. It should be no crime in me to divert the Nile or Danube from its course. Were I able to effect such purposes? Where then is the crime in turning a few ounces of blood from their natural channels? So obviously a rhetorical question, and for Hume, there is no problem with turning a few ounces of blood in a different direction. In the next generation of philosophers, Immanuel Kant, as a profoundly influential, he comes up with an absolute prohibition against suicide. I can't go over the details of the argument, but in the work Joe and I have done, we've had to deal with this quite often, and what we found in the literature is that there's some debate about exactly how strong and consistent this prohibition is. And so we've had seen some papers where people think there might be some wiggle room here, even though he talks so specifically about prohibiting it. We have some interesting views in the 19th century. The somewhat pessimistic Arthur Schopenhauer supported Hume and kind of chided his culture at Hume even being afraid to not publish it. Some theistic views, Søren Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, and specifically Christian existentialism, he reflects some typical prohibitions. John Stuart Mill doesn't talk directly about suicide, but I'm highly influenced by Mill. We're going to see how this comes through later when we want to talk about respect for autonomy. In the essay he wrote on liberty, the thesis he's addressing is, when can a government interfere with your freedom? And it can't be for your own good. And so he doesn't come out in this book and say anything directly about suicide, but implied in any kind of utilitarian calculus and the projection of consequences, the good over the bad consequences of your future courses, suicide would seem to be perfectly permissible. Some other interesting things in the first half of the 20th century I wanted to share with you. Suicide's considered a disease. So Minos points out that Joseph Guislian, for example, suggested using such moral sedatives as brutal showers, rotary machines, restraining chairs, isolation, hunger and thirst, threats, and attacks on the patient's self-image. That doesn't seem like a very good way to treat people that are suicidal. So we've come a long way. William James seemed to argue against it. We should avoid it. And then I wanted to also talk about the rise of the eugenics movement, that this was went through a phase where it was thought to be a very important and worthwhile thing to pursue. and it was inspired a lot from Darwin's Origin of Species. Francis Galton was a big proponent of it. Herbert Spencer coined this term, the survival of the fittest, and was partly responsible for developing social Darwinism. It ended up, though, in a very terrible place. If you remember this Buck v. Bell decision, Carrie Buck was a terribly violated child. She was in foster care. Her foster parents didn't treat her well. She was abused. And she was used basically as a pawn to work a case through the courts that would allow for sterilization. And it worked. And we have this famous quote from Justice Holmes, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Well, obviously, again, we think this is a profound moral violation, and we're going to find out more as we proceed. It reaches its zenith in moral depravity with this Nazi program. They called it euthanasia. It's a misnomer. They just murdered people. They tried to propagandize it by saying there was life unworthy of life. But to associate what they did with euthanasia is a complete misunderstanding. We have some interesting views from the atheistic existentialists, Heidegger, Sartre, and Camus. Camus actually came up with this saying from the myth of Sisyphus: there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. So these atheist existentialists are saying, well, really, we're some random accident. We're not any part of a grand purpose. We're not headed somewhere. People challenged it often. Why should we even continue living? And he doesn't answer it directly necessarily, but he does say at the end of the myth of Sisyphus, and as you know from the myth, it's a futile job of carrying a boulder up that only goes back down the hill. One must imagine Sisyphus happy in this task, that even though it's futile, we can still find some kind of fulfillment. So we don't seem to have an absolute prohibition from the existential, and with some support. In wrapping up this brief overview of some historical points, we just wanted to point out that we have some themes and kind of ebb and flow of attitudes towards suicide. There was never any real consistency. I also wanted to talk about the development of bioethics. It's been inspiring for me. I've always been drawn to bioethics, and the reasons that it came into being really had a lot to do with these points I have here. Are technological advances in mechanical ventilation, resuscitation, infectious diseases. The typical model before, doctor knows best, it actually worked very well for many, many years, hundreds of years actually. And part of the reason it worked well is there was only so much doctors could do. And most people that were sick that presented to a doctor just wanted to feel better and said, you know, well, tell me what to do so I can get better. And it was a pretty simple and straightforward relationship. But what happened in our contemporary day and age is we got so good at saving people's lives that they ended up being at times in a profound compromised state of existence, actually unprecedented states of existence that we've never seen before. And so we needed to then call on the work of many scholars, philosophers in particular, to try to help us make sense out of this, because it had never happened before. What I anticipated this point of the difficulties that we face. I want to spend a little bit of time now talking about some landmark cases in the history of bioethics. I'm going to have to, again, talk fairly briefly. Each one of these cases could be a complete presentation, and there's books written about all of these cases, but I'm going to really cut to the most significant themes. In your upper left is Dax Cowart. Below him is Elizabeth Bouvia. In the upper right is Karen Ann Quinlan, and below her is Nancy Cruzan. I've been deeply moved by all these cases, and I want to share a few salient features of each one. First, Dax Cowart was very active, self-directed young adult. He's with his father. They parked their car, unbeknownst to them, on something that was leaking gas, odorless gas. So when they tried to start their car, it blew up. And his father died at the scene, and he was horribly burned. The first person on the scene that came to him, Dax asked him to kill him. He was in such agony. I wanted to share with you a few excerpts of the way this case unfolded. This is just to give you an idea of the extent of the burns. There was Also specific damage, well, first of all, 65% of his body, it's a tremendous amount of your body to be burned in 2nd and 3rd degrees. There was specific damage to his left eye, which eventually had to be surgically removed. His right eye no longer functioned. His ears were almost completely destroyed. His fingers were burned off to the 2nd joint. As you know from burns, you have to clean them. It was a Hubbard tank. It was absolute agony. This is a quote from Dax on the Hubbard tanks. All I could do was scream at the top of my lungs until I would finally pass out with exhaustion. And there was no pain medication that did anything for him. I want to share with you a very common attitude in the 70s on these kinds of cases, because again, Dax is a good example of this new generation, so to speak, of difficulties that we have. Without the advanced technology, even in that day, you know, if he was burned this badly in the 1930s, he would have died. Healthcare practitioners, though, were leery that they were actually killing people. This made them feel uncomfortable. So look at this rehabilitation specialist. Don't ask us to let you die, because in a sense what that means is we're killing you. If you want to die, then let me fix your hands, operate on them, and open them up, so at least you can do something with them. And if you want to commit suicide, then you can, but don't ask us to stand here and literally kill you. So I think this is the idea that we want to try to have a better understanding of this, and we have evolved to have a better understanding, but healthcare practitioners can participate in helping a patient die without having to feel like they're not on solid moral ground. Dax was quite articulate. This is what he had to say about his treatment. The argument that not treating a patient is the same as killing borders on the ridiculous. If letting the patient die is characterized as playing God, then treating the patient to save his life has to be as well. In the final analysis, I was nothing more than a hostage to the current state of medical technology. The individual freedom of a competent adult should never be restricted except when it conflicts with the freedom of some other individual. That actually sums up a lot of the work that I do with Joe in bioethics. We put the patient at front and center and do everything we can to respect their autonomy. And I think Dax summed it up quite eloquently. Wanted to mention, sometimes people say killing, you know, we're playing God. From an intellectual standpoint, this doesn't really have much influential power. All it means is you've altered nature. So the Hoover Dam, a monumental engineering feat, is playing God. Surgery is playing God. If you remember what Dax said here, letting the patient die is playing God. Treating the patient is playing God. So they're both the same. So in terms of what we're allowed and prohibited to do, it isn't going to rest on that we're playing God. I wanted to close, Dax, with this statement. I'm enjoying life now and I'm glad to be alive, but I still think it was wrong to force me to undergo what I had to be alive. If the same thing were to happen tomorrow, knowing I could reach this point, I still would not want to undergo the pain and agony that I had to undergo to be alive now. I should want that choice to lie entirely with myself. So I wanted to talk about how this relates to paternalism in health, in bioethics. We want to sometimes try to help the patient, benefit the patient, and if we end up making decisions for the patient, it's a paternalistic view, and a lot of the times the paternalist wants to say, well, you'll thank me later. In the traditional sense, paternalism coming from a parent, that's perfectly appropriate. But when you're dealing with a competent adult, we generally don't want to make decisions for them. And you can see here that even though he ended up doing a lot of things that you would think would be worth it, he married, he had a career, he thinks it was certainly not worth it and that he was violated. Some wonderful wisdom on the case from Tristram Engelhardt Jr. I had the pleasure of meeting him in the 1980s. He's both an MD and a PhD. He's been very influential in the scholarship in bioethics. And he had this to say: the issue is the bounds and legitimacy of paternalism. In the end, the individuals, when able, must be allowed to decide their own destiny, even that of death. Competent adults should be allowed to make tragic decisions, if nowhere else, at least concerning what quality of life justifies the pain and suffering of continued living. It is not medicine's responsibility to prevent tragedies by denying freedom, for that would be the greater tragedy. And I think this sums up the Dax case quite well. And we're going to use this as we try to solve other cases. I wanted to bring up this case that I learned about on a quadriplegic patient to show you how far we've come and what is a much more appropriate attitude to have for a profoundly compromised state of existence. It would be called temporary paternalism. So a person who had previously lived a very active life was in a terrible accident and became a quadriplegic and ventilator dependent and found it to be a completely unbearable existence. And she wanted the ventilator removed and she wanted to be left to die. And because this had just happened, the healthcare staff felt very uncomfortable with such a quick decision. So they struck a deal and they said, look, we want you to try to deal with this for 2 months and see what it's like. You might find that you can actually have a fulfilling life in this condition. And so they agreed, they made a deal. Well, after 2 months, she said, well, thank you for this trial, but it's definitely not for me, and I want the ventilator removed. And they did remove it. And the healthcare practitioners did not have to feel like they were doing anything inappropriate because they were following the wishes of a competent patient. So even though, in many respects, when you remove someone from a ventilator that's ventilator dependent, you are contributing to their death, but that doesn't make it wrong. And the reason it isn't wrong is we're following their wishes. And it is also because of the circumstances. The second case is Elizabeth Bouvia. She had cerebral palsy, quadriplegia, degenerative arthritis, chronic pain, and again, had a fairly full life, married, divorced, a BA, didn't ever complete her MA, but did a lot of things you think would be fulfilling. But she admitted herself to a hospital in 1983, and this was her request to the hospital. I want to starve myself. I just want you to keep me comfortable. Well, the hospital was very uncomfortable with this request. And she gave a reason. This was her statement. I hate to have someone care for every personal need. It's humiliating. It's disgusting. And I choose to no longer do that, no longer to be dependent on someone to take care of me in that manner. I am choosing this course of action due to my physical limitations and disability. So I wanted to spend a minute talking about dignity. It's a highly subjective issue. Some people might find that when they need total care, they still feel dignified and they have wonderful caregivers. I don't think for Elizabeth this ended up being the case. For her, it ended up being an undignified situation, no matter how she tried to deal with it. And so for her, it just became unbearable. The lower court sides with the hospital and says, you know, we're going to feed you whether you like it or not. And this was kind of shocking to me, but I guess, you know, remember, this is 1983, so we still have a lot of hesitancy on any healthcare practitioner contributing to death. So they force-fed her. I found that to be, as I put it, an egregious violation of her bodily integrity. And this is an explanation of the feeding. At first, plastic tubing was inserted in the patient's mouth, but she bit through it. Thereafter, 4 attendants would hold her down while the tubing was inserted through her nose into her stomach and a liquid diet was pumped in. This is all against her will. And I think that I would think in today's day and age this wouldn't have happened. It shows you the evolution of our moral attitudes. So at this time, the healthcare team was winning even in the courts. And so they ended up violating her autonomy in a profound way. Eventually, she does win the right to refuse all treatment. And the reasoning of the court, the California Supreme Court, was this: we find nothing in the law to suggest the right to refuse medical treatment may be exercised only if the patient's motives meet someone else's approval. It certainly is not illegal or immoral to prefer a natural, albeit sooner, death than a drugged life attached to a mechanical device. And if we had time, we would go into it. She ended up voluntarily eating after this and living quite a number of years. I wanted to share with you this reaction from an Archbishop, Roger Mahoney. The court ruling does a profound disservice to society and dramatically weakens society's commitment to value and to protect all human life. Once a society decides that the human life of any one innocent individual can lose its value, and therefore that society should legally establish a person's right to suicide, we question the value of every person's life. Well, I think this is a flawed argument for many reasons. I mean, first of all, I want you to look at his statement about society deciding. Society is not deciding. Individuals are deciding. Elizabeth Bouvia, as an individual, decided for herself. This is not society's decision. And I would also call the ending a slippery slope fallacy. All of a sudden, we're not going to value every person's life. So I don't find this argument compelling. I wanted to contrast this with John Stuart Mill in his essay on liberty, When Should a Government Interfere with Our Lives? He says, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because in the opinion of others to do so would be wise or even right. I want you to pay attention to these last closing lines. This is a profound moral foundation of Western society. All of you should decide for yourselves how you want to conduct your lives. We don't tell you who to marry. We don't tell you what career to pursue. And notice, even if somebody thinks they can make better decisions for you, they shouldn't. I'm obviously pressed for time, so I'm going to go over these persistent vegetative states, Karen Ann Quinlan, quicker than I would like, but I just wanted to let you know the main theme that I wanted to get out of the Quinlan case. She ended up in a persistent vegetative state, somewhat mysteriously. She ingested a couple drinks at a bar, birthday party. She seemed to also have some aspirin, Valium. None of these toxicology reports were alarming, and yet she never seemed to recover from being in a persistent vegetative state. I'm going to not worry about the feedings were difficult. There was some interesting disparity on Catholic advice. One priest told the Quinlans, God has made the decision that Karen will die. You're just agreeing with God's decision, that's all. A Catholic nun administrator at the hospital who was insisting on keeping Karen alive said, you have to understand, Mrs. Quinlan, in this hospital, we don't kill people. So again, there's this idea of feeling responsible and that would be a moral violation. She was eventually weaned from a respirator, but the parents didn't feel comfortable withholding nutrition and hydration from her, so she literally lied in bed for 10 years until she died of complications of being bedridden for 10 years. You'll notice if you try to find pictures of her, the one I showed, her high school yearbook picture, is about the only thing you can come up with. The family was very protective about privacy, and it was honored, and so we don't see any pictures of her in her compromised state. I want to again talk briefly about a compelling case, Nancy Cruzan. She was in a single car accident and flipped her car over. She was thrown and she landed in a ditch face down that had some water in it. And so she was anoxic. That means her brain was denied oxygen for 13 minutes, which seems an incredibly long time. And she certainly should have not been able to survive. But somehow they did revive her. But she ended up in what we call a persistent vegetative state. I'm going to skip this quote. It's more of the same, the slippery slope kind of attitude about needing to keep Nancy alive. The parents did something that was extremely important in terms of moving forward. They won the right to have a feeding tube removed, and it was an extension of the idea that a competent patient can refuse any treatment, and you could consider nutrition and hydration in this manner a treatment. They just needed to know that this is what Nancy would have really wanted, and they were eventually able to show that. This is Nancy's tombstone, which I was always very moved by. On the top is an EEG. It eventually spells out the word thank you and then flat lines. Then they have her name, very standard wording, but I want you to notice there's birth, departed, and at peace. And the departed is the date of her accident. And this is a new state that we've never seen before. I've been referring to it as a persistent vegetative state. And it's very difficult in a sense. These patients are unresponsive, yet their brain stems are active, so we can't say that they're brain dead. And her family honored her in this way by marking, in a sense, two kinds of deaths. We also found a seminal article by James Rachels, written in the 70s, on trying to gain clarity on these kinds of cases. You know, when you remove a ventilator from a patient, if you stop giving life-sustaining treatment. There was a difference between active and passive euthanasia, and James Rachels challenged it. I think it epitomizes the job of the philosopher to try to clarify exactly what we're doing in these situations. And eventually, what happens through a lot of scholarship, I mean, this was the 70s, so for 40 years or so, papers are written and this idea is bantered around until finally we've agreed. If you remember the quadriplegic, you as a competent adult can refuse any treatment for any reason. I'm going to actually skip brain death for the sake of time, and I'm going to say a few brief comments on hospice and palliative care. We have entire chapters dedicated to this, but basically, it's a wonderful movement in the history of death and dying, and it did become inspired from all of these compromised states of existence that we saw. It started to spread in the 1970s. You have to have a terminal diagnosis. They emphasize comfort care, and their statement, the physical, psychological, social, and spiritual needs of the patient with concern for both the patient and the patient's family. Open communication and acceptance of death. We're very supportive of hospice in general. It's a major contribution, but in our work, we say that they stop short, and we're going to try to explain that as we move forward. Palliative care is a broader term of pain management, so you don't have to be terminally ill. They're trying to help in all stages of disease manage your pain, and it became a whole field of expertise. The reason I wanted to bring this up was that both the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, as they combined themselves into that organization, they have a statement about the inappropriateness of hastening death, and this is our challenge, that we think that this is an inappropriate limit. In the case of Washington v. Glucksberg, Dr. Glucksberg tried to challenge the courts on the rights of patients to have physician-assisted suicide, but the court said that hospice and palliative care are sufficient. We challenge that with a lot of statistics about just how difficult it is to manage pain. Many years later in Canada, they just recently said, well, suffering may involve loss of dignity. I want you to pay particular attention to dignity. It's very significant. And so the Canadian court said, maybe because there are exceptional cases, a ban on physician-assisted suicide is inappropriate. So just to show you why pain is so difficult, 46% of dying patients lack adequate pain treatment. Managing pain is complex. There's contraindications. Well, one of the things that fascinated me about pain management in my research on it is at first I thought it was a fairly straightforward business. You know, someone's in pain, you just give them some morphine. They're not better, give them a little more morphine, but it's not nearly that simple. I mean, first of all, and there's many different drugs than morphine, but if you give someone too much morphine, they die, they can't breathe. The second thing is sometimes from giving pain medication, you can have side effects. One of them is called myoclonic spasms. So instead of helping you with your pain, your body starts spasming uncontrollably. So it's a very difficult situation. So I just wanted to let you know that it's not necessarily so easy to manage pain. And in a contemporary setting like in our state, we have no physician-assisted suicide legislation. So if you're in a terminal situation, none of the healthcare practitioners can talk to you about how you might be able to hasten your death. And so those are some of the things we're going to discuss as we proceed. Physician-assisted suicide is growing in the United States. It started with this case, the case of Diane. I sometimes feel even guilty mentioning her name. She was never supposed to be known, but of course, you know, the cat got out of the bag, and now we know exactly who she is. But before anything was legal, Dr. Quill gave Diane a prescription for a suicide kit, which she filled and stuck in a drawer. And then Dr. Quill wrote a paper about it and sent it to the New England Journal of Medicine. And Marcia Angel was the editor. She called him up and said, "Are you sure you want me to publish this?" And he said, "Yeah, go ahead." And it caused quite an uproar. Court cases, but eventually no one was prosecuted. And the outline that he gives in his writing about how this can be operated became the first physician-assisted suicide law in Oregon. It's now legal in, I think, 9 states. In the Netherlands, they practice euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. The basic distinction is euthanasia, a doctor or a healthcare practitioner would kill you or assist in killing you, and in physician-assisted suicide, you do everything yourself. So you're given a prescription, you fill it, and you have to ingest it. No one can help you with it. I'm interested in what's going on in the Netherlands because it's been quite a few years and they're totally transparent. All of you can look up things about how many people have asked for euthanasia. They have detailed case studies. Some of them do seem to cause challenges, but they're totally transparent. And I would say we certainly haven't sensed a slippery slope about the lessening of the value of life. Now, we have a chapter that we wrote on a further difficulty. We can talk about end-of-life care, but there are other difficulties that we have that we'll call degenerative. So specifically here, a progressive dementia disorder means that you will inevitably become more and more demented. And Alzheimer's is the most common one, but there's other kinds of dementia. That it's progressive means you're never going to get better. So you might look at it as if you were on a staircase. So for many months, maybe even a year, you might be on the same level, but then something will happen and you suddenly lose some cognitive capacities, and then that's your new lower level, and you're never going to get any better. You'll just be at this level, or you'll just continue to get worse. And so what happens in these conditions? You know, we can't really call them terminal. Terminal usually means when you say, I'm terminally ill, you're going to die within 6 months to a year. Even if you have a disease that would kill you eventually over many years, we wouldn't say it's terminal when you first have it. So what are we to do with these kinds of situations? We're going to follow Hume's argument, and we look at life as instrumentally good. It's not intrinsically good. So this distinction philosophers make, an intrinsic good is good in and of itself. It's not for anything else. Probably happiness is our best example. There aren't many intrinsic goods. You know, self-actualization in a Maslowian term. Most things are instrumentally good. They're good for something. This monitor I'm using, the chairs you're sitting in, they're good because of a function that they serve. And we look at life as instrumentally good. It's good because of the other goods that flow from it. When all of those goods are taken away, then it loses its value for you as an individual. So the prohibitions that we face, for instance, sanctity of life, that doesn't account for our competing values. You know, you can say life, never kill, but we have to interpret it. If we commonly accept self-defense, if I can kill in self-defense, then that means that there isn't an absolute prohibition against killing. So we always have these competing values when we talk about prohibitions. And so there may be situations when it would be appropriate to commit suicide. We're going to use this justification for the progressive disorders as we would if you had a terminal disease. We argued that the death of your cognitive capacity is as great as biological death. So I summarized it this way. It is as reasonable to hasten the death of our biological lives in order to avoid the permanent loss of our cognitive capacity or autonomy, as it is to hasten the death of our biological lives due to a terminal illness. In this way, we consider suicide morally permissible under a progressive dementia disorder. So in other words, I've argued, and I would continue to try to support it, your loss of your capacity to be self-directed and autonomous is as profound as a physical death. So if you're given the choice between death and total dementia, I mean, people may choose differently. I don't think everybody would choose the same, but if they gave you that not so great choice and you chose death, that would certainly seem to be a reasonable option for you. We were inspired by a lawyer and scholar, Dina Davis. She worked for a while at Case Western Reserve, and she wrote an important paper for us. It was highly influential to the kind of arguments we wanted to develop about why progressive dementia disorder should count. She said, well, after you're not competent anymore, you can't control any of your assets, you're going to need to be taken care of, and most importantly, your narrative, how you want people to remember you. There's an influential case by a psychologist, a Cornell psychologist, Sandy Bem. She actually did a protocol we would want to follow. Before she was fully demented, she obtained drugs from Mexico that would kill her because she couldn't obtain them in her state. And she had, with the assistance of her ex-husband, killed herself before she became fully demented. I wanted to talk about Phil Whiting. It was a book by a gentleman named John Newland who went over many ways that we die. And Phil had a very terrible difficulty with Alzheimer's. And so I wanted to share some poignant comments on this. The 3 children found it impossible to be a witness to the destruction of their adored father, and it was good that this was so. Janet also wanted to protect him, wanted him to be remembered as he had been, a man of vibrant goodwill who carried himself not only with dignity, but with a sense of style that was uniquely all his own. I wouldn't let our friends visit the home. I didn't want them to see him like that. Finally, all contact and all control were lost. Phil became totally incontinent, but was quite aware of it. Urine soaking his clothes and smeared sometimes with his feces, he would have to be undressed to clean off the filth that profaned the pittance of his humanness still left to him. And this was a man, said Janet, who had always been so proud of his appearance and so dignified. If there was any way he could have known what was happening to him, he wouldn't have wanted to live. And when he died, I was glad. I know it sounds terrible to say that, but I was happy he was relieved of that degrading sickness. In other words, look at the term dignity, degrading, and the idea that his wife didn't even want anybody to see him. This is his narrative. They didn't want this to be a part of his narrative. So I would give you the details of the dementia disorder, but I'm running short of time, and I want to talk a little bit more about our thesis, so I can't really address all these criticisms. I'd be happy to do it in a question-answer session. But I wanted to talk more directly about the way we tried to develop a thesis on the morality and legality of hastening death. First of all, our justification comes from moral theory. So we don't use any dogma, we don't use any holy books. It's the standard way philosophers approach things. I mean, you can try to use holy books, but there's serious problems. We can't interpret them, we don't know which holy book to take. Even if we decided on a specific book, there would be problems of interpretation. I mean, one commandment is thou shalt not kill. And well, we already brought up self-defense. Then a translation was, thou shalt not murder. That seems to be a step in the right direction, but it just delays the problem. Now we have to ask, what constitutes murder? So as philosophers, we have to have a foundation to justify our views as best we can from a secular perspective, and what we've used is the value of respect for autonomy as the #1 leading principle. I've heard, not just from me, other people say it's the gold standard of bioethics. I want to be clear that I'm not saying it's an absolute value. Patients sometimes ask for completely unreasonable things. So you don't just do whatever a patient asks for. We've also brought up temporary paternalism. But the idea is that all other things being equal, we would want to put at the highest priority respecting the autonomy of a competent patient. We are inspired by Kant. His deontology is deontological ethics. Always treat others as an end, never merely as a means. I've read from you some excerpts from John Stuart Mill. And so we borrowed from Principalism. It's a highly influential book that came out originally in the middle 70s. It's in many editions now. I find it highly valuable. I was really influenced by this. We just wanted to tweak it a little bit. They present you with 4 principles: respect for autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice. But they just put them in like a big bushel basket. You're supposed to weigh them. I never looked at it that way. Which, for us, what you want to do is you first turn to respect for autonomy and see if you can honor that. And if you can, you're on solid moral ground in the vast, overwhelming majority of times. And then as other circumstances arise, we may need to look at the other principles. But by and large, we're going to uphold respect for autonomy as much as we can. To show you how this might work, I want to talk to you about a Jehovah's Witness refusal of blood. This is a standard request that's honored, regardless of the circumstances. I mean, it just, for instance, if you had a young adult, say in their 30s, they have young children, they have a serious condition, it would require a potential blood transfusion. If the patient says, I don't want it, we would not give it. An interesting case came in this similar manner. The patient told the physician, under no circumstances in this surgery are you to give me a whole blood transfusion. And there was a chance he would need it. And the surgeon was very uncomfortable with this. So when he sought advice from the bioethicist, he was given two choices. The bioethicist said, you can perform the surgery and honor his request, or you can try to find him another doctor that will do that. But what you're not permitted to do is lie to the patient and give him blood behind his back. So even though there was so much at stake for this patient, and he had a lot more to live, and it's a relatively routine procedure, we still honored that request. So I put the key point would be to establish social policies that properly balance the needs of patients desiring to hasten their deaths under a number of circumstances with the burdens this would impose on healthcare professionals who would be required by law to provide support. So we understand there's a burden to healthcare professionals. There's always been a burden. It's part of their professional obligation. But as we've seen in the evolution of bioethics and these cases, that even if a healthcare practitioner is directly involved in hastening the death of a patient, it's not necessarily something that's immoral. We find physician-assisted suicide. The requirement of the assistance from others is consistent with the goals of medicine because not all conditions are curable. A lot of the times physicians will say it's inconsistent with our professional obligations as caregivers. Well, if we could cure everything, I would have more sympathy with that view, but we can't. So the value of life is not absolute. It has to be juxtaposed with other values. And you can have advanced directives, but those can be overridden. And the closer to death, the easier these justifications can be. I only have a couple minutes left, so I'm just going to quickly gloss over some concluding remarks here. In these practices, these are ways you can hasten your death if you're either if terminally ill or you, have a progressive dementia disorder. One is you can refuse life-sustaining treatment, and this is well established. We already have gone over the case of the quadriplegic, and we really don't have much moral consternation about this anymore. Everyone's on board. Voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. What happens here is the patient refuses to eat and drink anymore. And we looked at this as kind of an act of desperation. So I paraphrase voluntarily stopping eating and drinking this way. I want to hasten my death due to a medical condition, but there are no legally acceptable means. So I will do that which is within my power and engage in voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. I hope that you, the healthcare professionals, provide me with comfort care throughout this process. Had I more options, I likely would have pursued something that would be more efficient and effective at hastening my death. So this is something all of you can do if you would want. You can simply say, like Elizabeth Bouvia said, I'm not going to eat or drink anything anymore. I'd like you to provide me with comfort care. We also have continuous sedation until death. I'd like to expand on this a great deal, but basically this is a way of controlling pain. The problem is in deep sedation, you have no conscious states. I mean, you don't dream either. So it's not as if you're sleeping or something. So it's a complete blackout. And in one paper we argued, well, that's the same as death, the total blackout of all mental states. It's hard to distinguish it. We have physician-assisted suicide on the rise. We're hoping it expands to all 50 states. Voluntary euthanasia, you would ask someone to assist you. The most common thing would be in the current physician-assisted suicide protocol, you may, right before you were going to ingest medicine, be unable to. And so someone might be able to help you. And we understand the ethics of this is more complicated, and I would need a lot of time to try to justify it. But I came up with an interesting analogy, that point about would you help a quadriplegic friend smoke a cigarette? Just use it as a food for thought. I can't digress, but I was curious about this. I mean, it almost seems discriminatory to not help people do things they want to do just because they have a physical limitation and they would do it if they could. I don't have time for those, and I'm going to just say there's been a lot of arguments against our position, and with sufficient time, I would show you the details of why the doctrine of double effect is really not a very good argument. The wrongness of killing is overridden by other competing values. And I wanted to close with this. We're going to emphasize respect for autonomy always, as much as we can. And at the close of our book, we said, we all desire a good death, and we turn to medicine to help us, but often medicine turns its back on us. We hope that our work here will allow for a greater chance of realizing the etymological meaning of euthanasia, a good death. Thank you very much. We have some microphones in the front, so I'd like to ask for people to feel free to come up and challenge me or ask any questions about the presentation.
Hi. How realistic do you think, how soon do you think all 50 states would be likely to fully legalize euthanasia? In our lifetime or in our grandchildren's lifetime?
I wish I could have a crystal ball. I'll just say this, it's 9 and counting.
Right.
The momentum is there. I want to say this too, as far as a slippery slope, people say, oh, if we have physician-assisted suicide, it's going to lead to terrible things. I don't think that's been the case. It's been the reverse. We had Oregon, then we had Washington, and it's growing. So I think we're finding that it is a morally sound practice. It's a matter of time. I don't know if my writing partner, do you have a crystal ball on this? Any project? But are you optimistic we're going in that direction?
All 50 states.
Not in all 50?
That's going to be a long time.
Well, according to my writing partner, a long time. But, I think it will grow. Canada did it in one fell swoop.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Professor Prima, I only commend you on your comments in your presentation today. Your scholarship and your courage is inspired.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate that, Sean.
I wonder if you had looked into depression as a state that is in any way justified for physician-assisted suicide.
Sean, excellent. I'm so glad you brought up depression is very tough, and I want to give you a couple different scenarios. The problem with depression in our stance is we want to value respect for autonomy, and after that it's of a competent patient. So this is where it gets difficult, because if you're depressed, we might question your competence. But there was a very fascinating case in the day and age of Immanuel Kant. He had this absolute prohibition against suicide, and he had a very dear friend who was in her 60s, and she wrote him this very moving letter. And what she had said was, look, I'm going to kill myself, and I'll tell you why. I've been battling this for 40 years. I'm just tired. So that was, in a sense, to me, a little bit more acceptable. In other words, if you're in your 20s and you're depressed clinically, we would want to hopefully put on a full court press and help you and hope you get over a hump. But I think if you know from talking to people with depression, it's profound. It's very difficult. It isn't, I'm having a sad day. This is really, really difficult. We had a colleague here, I used to pass him in the hall all the time, a wonderful man, Bill Richter, and one day I read he killed himself. It was shocking to me, but I think I can understand. He would dealt with things that were probably far more profound than I could ever imagine. So my long and short answer would be, the younger you are, the more we would want to try to help you avoid it. The older you get, the more I might be willing to acquiesce to your request. But again, we'd want to say you'd have to have a minimum level of competence for any decision like that. So if the depression is so much so that you're not competent, then we can't.
Thank you so much for your scholarship in this area. I have more of a comment than a question. My name is Ann Rowland, and I'm here with a colleague, Amy Foti, and we are with an organization called Ohio End of Life Options, and we are an active group in Ohio that is trying to get a medical aid in dying statute passed here in Ohio. As you indicated, the trend is definitely forward in this direction. I think it'll be a long slug in Ohio, but many states are getting pretty close. So,
Do you mind if I ask you in terms of your, what do you think about moving this forward? You said it's going to be sluggish. Do you have any kind of timeline and goals that you think you're projecting for yourself?
Well, most states that have passed this legislation have worked for almost a decade to get it done. So it takes a long time. I think with our state legislature in Ohio, it's a challenge because there's a heavy influence of the religious right that is generally opposed to these statutes. There is an alternative to going the legislative route, and that would be a ballot initiative. That's very expensive. And so we are exploring all options at this point. We have a website if anybody wants any more information called ohiooptions.org.
Thank you very much. Please.
I just want to say thank you for your help. Being a psych nurse for 40 years.
Would you mind coming up? Because it's going to be here.
I have.
Oh, sure. Can you get this over to her?
But my mother and my aunt and my grandmother, this past year, my mother just went through the full cycle, and there are definite stages of persistent dementia. And as my brother had asked me, as she forgot the last 2 years who her family was, can't you do something? And as a nurse, I said, my hands are tied. And if anyone ever has that experience, they will understand it's a gift to release the patient, loved one, family member, as that one, I forget his name,
Phil Whiting.
had said, because there was no dignity. It was, if you want to be a financial, it was a financial burden to the family, to the state, to everyone. So I would like to, for the younger generation, say, please help that young lady, I forgot, in passing something like that, because I've seen it from all sides. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Please, anybody else? Yes, go ahead.
Just to kind of emphasize on that, my father died 6 years ago from a brain tumor, and I remember while he was in hospice care, he was at home with me, and I was the one helping him out. And you know, you can choose whether or not to have a nurse there, but they kind of let you facilitate that experience on your own. And I kind of felt in that situation it was a little bit of a loophole so that my father could go a little more how he wanted to, but maybe not as quickly. Like over the few months that he had such an aggressive tumor, he lost his eyesight, his hearing, and his memory, and he would just look at me and just be like, Sarah, I'm sorry, I don't remember, and I just lost him, you know, along the way, wouldn't be able to eat. So I feel like this is such an important thing that not a lot of people are talking about because it is taboo, and I really appreciate all the experience and all the help along the way, just because I feel like it is moving in a forward direction. And again, like as a family member, that's tough, but I do have patients frequently that have these types of cancers, and it's like, I don't know what I can do.
Yeah, in our state, not much. I agree. And again, you're a nurse?
I'm actually a nuclear medicine technologist. You were at our symposium last month, and I really enjoyed it.
How would you say we manage pain? How well do we do?
It's really difficult. Again, especially with morphine, you don't know how much to give people. It's a spectrum. Right. You know, for somebody, something is 1, for somebody else, it's 10. So it's like you can't give the same amount. It's very specialized care, you know.
Yeah, I had an interesting experience doing rounds with palliative care experts and at the Cleveland Clinic, and I got the biggest kick out of it didn't seem very sophisticated. They would see a patient, and then they would run around the corner and just take little pieces of paper and do all these calculations to figure out, and then they would go back in, and then the next patient they would go in. Each patient had to be dealt with individually, and it was not necessarily such a easy science to figure out how to best manage pain. Also, you brought up an important point. I didn't have time to talk about it. It's titration. So you gradually increase pain medication. What they don't tell you about it is all the while you're trying to find that sweet spot, the patient is suffering. And so sometimes that can take a long time, and by the time you find the sweet spot, it might not even, it might be too late. Oh, go ahead. Yes, please.
So I'm not sure if you're familiar much with the case, but I know an article recently mentioned that a gold medal Paralympian, Marieke Vervoet, recently took the option of euthanasia. And so she had a degenerative spinal condition that caused her pain, and she dealt with epilepsy. I'm not fully familiar of all the specifics of it, but the question would be, where would you think the line for when physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia would be acceptable? How close towards a terminal end would it have to be? Or is it something that if the patient knows this will be the end, can they accept it earlier?
Yeah. Thank you. Let me try to answer it briefly. It's obviously an involved question. I would say, first of all, if you look at common laws now, the most common thing is you have to be within 6 to 12 months of your death. But we didn't address progressive disorders, so I tried to do it briefly. And in that situation, we would say, when you're at, if you're going to be demented, before you're fully demented, but you've still eked it out long enough to have a fulfilling life. If you have a chronic condition of pain, something like that, that's probably the toughest case, because it depends if we could call it progressive. In other words, it's only going to get worse, and we know that. Then I think it would be a matter of finding in a utilitarian calculus. In other words, when she projects her future, is it more suffering than is worth being alive? And so as a philosopher, I think I could draw that line. In terms of legislation, that's a much more difficult task. But I would say we would probably lean on utilitarianism as a theory. I could digress on that more, but I don't have time. But it would be a matter of projecting your future consequences and seeing if it would be, the expression is, are you better off dead? And if you could really document that, then that would be a line that I would draw. You'd have to have a competent patient and a progressive disorder. But thank you for the question. A very difficult question. Just in terms of law, I think the best way to go now in the short term is physician-assisted suicide. That way, healthcare practitioners don't have to be directly involved, and the patient always does the killing him or herself, so we don't have to worry about a slippery slope of people killing each other. How am I doing on time? I don't have... Oh, you're trying to wait. Okay. 2 minutes? 3 minutes. Okay, so I can have, I thought I saw a couple other questions. Go ahead. My peace conflict colleague, yes?
Thank you, Sam. Really appreciated your presentation today, and looking forward to, at some point, reading your work. And there were two things that I'm pondering after listening and seeing your presentation. One, I guess, is less of a ponder and more of a thank you for just emphasizing the aspect of human dignity and the important role that plays. And the second one is, I guess, a question of when someone makes a decision to participate in a doctor-assisted suicide. I am from Oregon and Washington states, and I've had friends and family members who have partaken in that process. And can you speak at all to how do other people that are associated with that individual kind of reconcile that person's decision when it might not align with their values and beliefs? Does that make sense?
Sure. No, I appreciate it. The first thing I would like to mention about something like that is we emphasize that we're patient-centered and respect for autonomy. So the patient's values and their decision get top priority. And then the other people that may be disagreeing, in a sense, they're secondary. So I would prioritize. The priority is the patient and their desires. And other people have to be willing to come around to it, because think about it this way, with Dax Cowart, who's in the hover tank? He's the one in the hover tank. So he should have top priority in terms of decision making. So I think the other family members should do the best they can to have respect for the wishes of the person that's actually going through it. They're the ones that matter the most. And again, I'm assuming we have competence and that we want to respect it. Could I take one more maybe? Was there something from over here? Yes, please.
I was just saying that if somebody watched someone
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you for that comment. And are we out of time?
Yes,
So
we're out
closing
of
time.
time. Wow, this was very powerful. Let's give Professor Prima. So, on behalf of the Division of Social Sciences and the Western Campus, we would like to present you with a token of our appreciation, and we thank you. Just real quickly, guys, in terms of as I mentioned before, there's a reception with the author, and you may be able to engage him and ask him some more questions. Unfortunately, the books have not arrived yet for the book signing. So what we'll do is we'll have a table out there. The bookstore will take your name, and they will do pre-orders, and then you will get a signed copy of the book. So again, thank you all for being here with us today, and thank you, Sam.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It was an honor. Thank you.